Breaking news as mutiny spreads throughout China, led by a youth movement named Bai Lan, which stands for Let It Rot, which is actually from the NBA when teams would lose on purpose to get a better draft round pick. This has completely freaked out the Chinese government and the president of China, and now the freedom of speech is all but extinct, being swept under the rug of turmoil, debt, debauchery, and repressed citizens. This video is going to come with a warning on how the US is actually the next China. We're going to take you guys deeper under the hood than we've ever taken you before to show you guys mathematically that we are going to collapse as a society and our economy is holding on by a hair. If you're like me and wondering why haven't we gone in recession yet, and also if you're like me wondering why people are saying we're already in recession, being we still have an overwhelming amount of cash in the system and we don't have really any credit tightening whatsoever. So what if I told you guys the reason for the collapse is because the system is at maximum capacity without an ability to absorb any of the Federal Reserve and government's forever deficit. Today's co-host is none other than Mitch Vexler. Happy Sunday evening. How are you, sir?
Good. Today we're going to attempt to connect the dots both at the federal level, which we've been working on in terms of the debt, and the local taxing entity level. And it's going to be a little bit deep. It's going to be a little bit rocky, but with a little bit of luck, by the time we're done this, a lot of what we've been talking about for the last 45 or 50 days is going to start to sink in.
Yes, and obviously to the viewers, Mitch is happy and excited to go under the hood to look at the math. It's going to be a doozy today. But let's start with the origins of Bai Lan. Bai Lan is a rising phenomenon among China's youth that has gained significant attention in recent years. The concept of Bai Lan reflects a growing sentiment of frustration and disillusionment among Chinese people who are choosing to voluntarily withdraw from pursuing certain goals due to perceived insurmountable challenges. This attitude involves actively embracing deteriorating situations rather than attempting to improve them. Similar to other Chinese phrases like to smash a crock pot and dead pigs are not afraid of boiling water. Now, factors contributing to Bai Lan is number one, economic uncertainty. We have seen them, Mitch, destroy entire towns of skyscrapers. Now, a shrinking economic opportunities and high unemployment rates among young people have fueled these attitudes with over 18% unemployment. Again, 18% unemployment for Chinese youth. There's also social pressures. The intense competition of high social expectations in Chinese society has led many young people to feel overwhelmed and discouraged. Number three, a lack of social mobility. Young Chinese perceive the lack of social mobility, which contributes to their adoption of the Bai Lan attitude. I don't know what they mean by perceived because there's definitely a lack of mobility. Increased uncertainty. Unlike previous generations, today's Chinese youth face greater uncertainties and find it difficult to make long-term plans for their lives. Few manifestations of Bai Lan. Number one, career aspirations. Number two, obviously housing. Number three, education and personal development. This is starting to sound a lot like the US. If you guys agree with me, comment below. Now, what I want to do, Mitch, is I'm going to play a clip from a Chinese official that has been asked to respond to Bai Lan and to the massive amounts of protests. Now, I'm going to play this video after he sat in silence for 30 seconds. Okay, so I'm sparing you as the viewer the 30 seconds of silence. Now, again, this is a Chinese official being asked this question.
Could you repeat the question, please?
A question from Reuters. Given the widespread display of frustration with the zero COVID policy, is China considering ending it soon? And if so, when?
很快的时期内结束这个政策，如果是的话，什么时候会结束？
你谈到的有关情况与事实不符。
He's a man of many words, Mitch, man of many words. First question, should the Chinese government be concerned about this mutiny or rebellion or however else the media wants to coin this to put shame upon it?
As I said a few videos ago, when you make people desperate, they do desperate things. And isn't it interesting that number 4 that you showed, followed by 1, 2, and 3, are exactly verbatim what is happening in the United States? Precisely. You couldn't get it any more closely aligned. So then the question becomes why? Well, here we go with the debt. And make no mistake, although it is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, they are full-throated capitalists in their own pocket. And we are supposed to be capitalists here, but the nexus between the two and the desperation being sought on both populations, both continents, are in fact debt. The debt has been created on levered bonds, and those levered bonds are being used for nefarious purposes. The bonds themselves are weapons of mass destruction, as are the missiles that those bonds finance, weapons of mass destruction. And that is what you're seeing play out. When you make people desperate, they will do desperate things.
Okay. I mean, great answer, man. Let me show the viewers now how this movement is growing steam. In recent days, the phrase, and more previously, Tang Ping, which stands for lying flat, which means rejecting grueling competition for a low desire life, gained popularity as high social expectations prompted many young Chinese to give up on hard work. And honestly, I can't blame them. Honestly, Mitch, so far, I wish our youth had a hard work problem. You know what I mean? But let's go on. But Bai Lan has more worrying layer in the way it is being used by young people in China to actively embrace a deteriorating situation rather than trying to turn it around. It is close to other Chinese phrases like we just went over. Now, the state media has taken note of this trend, and they're asking why modern young Chinese like to Bai Lan. One recent article in an official media outlet asked, in fact, this is a result of negative auto-suggestion, repeatedly telling oneself, I cannot make it. So it has nothing to do with reality. That's interesting. And this kind of mentality often leads people to adapt a Bai Lan attitude. This reeks of biasness, but let's keep going. But the reality is not quite as state media suggested, says Sal Hong, a 29-year-old creative industry professional in Beijing. He says that for his generation of young Chinese, this attitude of letting things rot is likely caused by a lack of social mobility and increased uncertainty in today's China. Unlike my parents' generation, young Chinese today have much bigger expectations, but there are many more uncertainties for us. For example, we cannot make any long-term plans for our lives anymore because we do not know what is going to happen to us even 5 years down the road. I can personally draw multiple parallels between what's going on there and what's going on in the US, but the difference there is how the government deals with the protesting. Take a look at this.
We need to be brave, this man says. Am I a criminal for holding a flower? Dragged away by police, but unclear if arrests alone can stop simmering anger from nearly 3 years of harsh COVID lockdowns boiling into something bigger. Protests this week in cities across the country. And in the capital, students at this elite Beijing university turning blank pieces of paper into a symbol of resistance, calling for democratic rule of law and freedom of speech.
There's obviously a war on freedom of speech. Now, I asked you the last question, should the government be concerned? But now let me switch that up. Should the citizens be concerned and worried about the government?
In the case of China, yes, because the Chinese army is huge. The Chinese army is brainwashed, and the Chinese army will go against its citizens. That does not happen in the United States. The US military forces will not turn against their citizens. That would be a delusional belief on behalf of the government. So these things, this fellow that you just had on, the Chinese diplomat, he is the equivalent of our Corinne Jean-Pierre. What they want is you should not believe your pocketbook. You should not believe your eyes, and you should be in delusion as they are. And it comes down to, can I put food on the table? Can I have children? And you know that they have birth issues in China, affordability issues. And when you start stripping those things away, you make people desperate. And that's what all this comes down to.
Let's talk about the government response. Initially, the Chinese government allowed some rallies to proceed, but there were reports of arrests and use of force against protesters, again, leading to deaths. Now, by early December 2022, China began to pivot away from its zero COVID policy, reducing testing and lockdowns. I mean, seriously, think about these citizens watching the entire world free except for them. I mean, they're watching stadiums full of football and soccer, and meanwhile, they're locked down. Aftermath and recent developments. University actions. In the immediate aftermath, some universities sent students home and moved classes online to prevent further gatherings. That's insane. So to stop the protesting, let's learn from home. Ongoing labor issues. A report from early 2024 indicated a rising number of protests related to labor and property issues. Go figure. Continued repression in Hong Kong. While not directly related to mainland protest, Hong Kong has seen ongoing crackdowns on freedoms, which has sparked some protests against Chinese rule. This sucks. Censorship and memory erasing. As of May 2024, there were reports of Chinese authorities attempting to erase the memory of the white paper protest, indicating ongoing efforts to control the narrative. You guys listening? Number 5, labor protest in 2024. Labor protest. Do we have any strikes going on right now? Maybe a port strike, auto, rider union, Boeing just fired 17,000 people. The China Labor Bulletin reported 719 collective actions in the first half of 2024, slightly up from 696 year over year, suggesting a labor-related unrest. Number 6, recent economic protests. As of October 13th, 2024, there are reports of Taiwan protesting against what it calls China's economic oppression, indicating ongoing tensions in the region. And again, that's today. Hong Kong arrests 6 for sedation under new law. Again, warning to you guys, Hong Kong has announced its first arrest under a new law security, detaining 6 people for publishing, you guys ready? Sit down, social media posts which incited hatreds, according to them. 5 women and 1 man were arrested on Tuesday. Officials said the group were posting messages targeting a sensitive date. If found guilty, the group could face up to 7 years in prison under the harshest penalties brought to law, known as Article 23. Holy super scary. This is also interesting. The historical forces behind the student rebellion in Bangladesh. I'm just going to read this first paragraph. This just to show you guys, when we unite, we can make change. Last week, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh was forced to resign from her position and flee the country. Throughout July, she had been cracking down on mass protests, probably a bad idea, lady, led largely by college students against her increasingly authoritarian rule. Listen to this, Mitch. This is insane. More than 300 people were killed and thousands were jailed through these protests. So in other words, she left the country, she bailed out of the country, she ran away from its citizens. My question to you, Mitch, is this the only way to make change against a corrupt and toxic government? Is the only way to make change to unite? I'm not talking about violence. Okay, this didn't say anything about these protesters being violent, did it? It only said they were being maimed and killed and arrested. It didn't say they were being violent. Is this the only way to create change, my friend, in numbers?
Well, in their particular case, be it Bangladesh or China, the violence is being activated by the government. Standing there with a piece of paper in the United States falls under the First Amendment. So we also have the Second Amendment, which is there to stop tyranny of a government. And as I've been saying, the key issue here, what we're trying to do is simply raise the issues to make people understand what the debt levels are. And as I said, we exported our garbage across the globe. and our garbage is the debt. Then they took it and learned from us how to expand that debt and increase their bonds, thereby increasing their debt per capita. So the nexus between all these countries, isn't it interesting, is the fact that they've been trying to stifle free markets. They've been trying to kill off free markets. Well, let's take this up one notch. Who is the world's largest owner of hotels? Would you believe it's the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, by far the largest owner of hotels on the globe. Well, how did they get them? Where did they get them? Drugs don't move out of that country without the authority of the government. The drugs get laundered, the money gets laundered through the banks, mysteriously ends up in the hands of the CCP, and the CCP mysteriously ends up as the world's largest owner of hotels. One hell of an economic machine. So things aren't what people perceive them to be. Free markets are the only answer, end of story, because then people have a right. They have the ability under a free market. They either make it or they don't, but everybody's on the same playing field. The playing field now has been so perverted that you're starting to see these pushbacks globally.
Mitch, isn't it fair to say another nexus is actually U.S. debt?
Well, it's all in reality U.S. debt. Why? Because we exported our garbage. We exported our treasuries. China holds $4 trillion of our treasuries. And that's what we've been trying to explain. You have a federal level debt problem, and you have a local taxing entity debt problem, of which the schools are 83% liable for that debt at the local taxing entity. So it's happening in all directions. That's here, obviously, in the US. But when our bonds get exported and our treasuries get exported and people around the globe have this, and nobody can figure out what the real value is due to all these problems. I mean, we went through Boeing yesterday, just as an example. So the idea that somebody in Boeing said, well, we're going to ramp up and we're going to sell stock in the face of Boeing's stock price disintegrating, and in the face of labor disputes, and in the face of, well, we don't have a clear performer because we don't know how to fix this, is the exact same problem that the governments are doing. We'll just go out and print more money. Quantitative easing in perpetuity, and that destroys the US dollar. If the US dollar goes down, we go down, all the other countries go down with us.
Let's warn the viewers and show the viewers mathematically how the US is the next China. But it's actually, we're already China. It's like China's trying to catch up with us. Isn't that crazy to think about? And so to the viewers, what I'm going to do is the best I can to go over a 15-page document. I'm going to go over it quickly, and it's going to explain to you guys mathematically how we're going to be led into the next financial collapse. And I'm going to tell you guys, again, this will be linked in the description. This entire paper and workup, this 15-page paper, absolute genius. Essentially, it's just, in so many words, it's saying that government debt is destroying and has destroyed the world. Fantastic article. It came out on Saturday, October 12th. Funding spikes, wartime balance sheets, and endgame. The Q3 quarter end repo spike could point to reserve scarcity, but more likely, and here's the important thing, indicates that dealers are reaching capacity limits. So this article is going to go into the repo market, which is essentially borrowing from the lender. And it's also going to go into the reverse repo market, which I want you guys to remember is lending. So the lenders will lend reverse repo and they will borrow with the repo. And meanwhile, the government deficit for this year is 1.8 trillion. So those are the things I want you to remember. Dealers are forced to comply with balance sheet constraints, leverage ratios proposed to prevent their bank holding companies from taking on too much risk, too much leverage. Because why do we need that to the viewers? So we don't have to bail them out and ruin generational wealth anymore. The moonshine of treasury issuance, which dealers are forced to absorb, finance, and hold on their balance sheet, means that even when things seem placid, their fragility only grows. Don't forget, with Basel III, banks have to hold on to 10%. And this is also going into the fact that they also have to hold on to treasuries. And it's those two things combined that is going to collapse this entire market, there's a straightforward solution to increasing a dealer's ability to provide liquidity and make markets, and that is exempting treasuries from said regulations. Okay, that is absolutely horrible. That is a forever quantitative easing that is allowing banks to control the United States government. That is what that would do, in my opinion. Now, this would make banks a limitless marginal buyer of treasuries, a crossing of the Rubicon moment for U.S. Treasuries and the first step towards an end game. Only a couple days ago, Zero Hedge cited a repo guru, which sent Treasury repo rates spiking above even what was offered at the Fed's repo facility. The facility's design was created to prevent another September 2019 episode when repo rates spiked far above the Fed's target rate. So remember, the repo market is borrowing cash by Treasury collateral. Here it is right here. Here's the spike right here. A reverse repo trade is the opposite. It's lending cash because they have too much and accepting Treasury collateral to secure the trade. If private sector borrowers such as pensions, hedge funds, or asset managers need cash, they first tend to borrow in a private repo. As a last resort, they can borrow cash from the Fed's repo facility. Think of repo borrowing as a service and realize that it's increased demand for repo borrowing that puts upward pressure on repo rates. If $100 needs to be financed, but only $90 is available to be lent, the borrowers will compete with one another by offering to pay higher and higher rates. The Fed's repo backstop, the repo rate, should act as a ceiling on rates. Now, the opposite is true for the reverse repo. On the other hand, if private sector lenders have cash to deploy, they will first seek to lend in private reverse repo. So that's the lending. This is crazy. As a last resort, they can lend cash to the Fed. This is insane. That's why the banks run America. Think of the repo lending as a service, more cash available, more competitive rates, and realize that it's an increased supply of repo lending that puts downward pressure on repo rates. If there is $100 available to be lent, but only $90 is needed to be financed, the lenders will compete with one another by offering to accept lower and lower rates. The Fed's reverse repo backstop the reverse repo's rate, act as the floor. So we got a ceiling and we got a floor. Now, rate spikes equal funding squeezes. I want you guys to remember that. There are three key fundamentals. Cash, we got plenty of that. We can see that at M2. Collateral, dealer balance sheet capacity. With that in mind, the easy way to see funding rate spikes, such as in the repo, is to deduce that it signals a cash shortage. Do you want to sum up what I just went over?
So several points here. First of all, in my humble opinion, for what it's worth, this document is probably the best produced document Zero Hedge has ever put out, certainly as far as what Travis and I and everybody around me have been working on in these series of videos since we started. What you're seeing is the explanation of the damage that can be done under the hood that the public is not privy to. The people that wrote that article are the dealers. Now, I don't know exactly who wrote the article, but the graphs are clear. And a summary, Travis, is that the more the government delays the inevitable, as I said under the rule of 72, the larger the damage is going to be. And this article confirms that. And it confirms it from the standpoint of the banks that have the cash, putting it into the government, i.e. through the repo. Well, when a repo spike occurs, that's a volatility spike. And since we've started these videos, I've been hammering on this is about volatility, not necessarily the price, because nobody knows what that trigger is going to be to start a collapse. But how do you go bankrupt? Very slowly, and then all of a sudden, all at once. Could it be the repo itself or the failure of the quantitative easing that they're about to hit the start button again that in fact creates the Treasury volatility spike? Yeah, it really could be. So this article is looking at it from the federal perspective. We've looked at it from the local taxing entity perspective. Either way, it's really bad.
Yeah.
With regard to Basel III, I want to point a couple things out. Basel III was a knee-jerk reaction to Basel I and Basel II failing. So then they came in and said, okay, fine, we're going to give a increase in the Tier 1 capital requirement up to 6%. But I've also said in the past that they keep moving the goalposts. Well, Basel I was a goalpost. Basel II was a goalpost. Basel III is a goalpost. And now we're looking down the shotgun barrel of what's in this article, and they're moving it again. But here's why they're going to move it. Well, they're going to move it because Basel III didn't even take into account the value of the treasuries, nor did it take into account the volatility spike that can occur in the treasuries. And the same for the mortgage-backed securities, the bonds. Either way, if you didn't take into account the volatility spike, how can you possibly do mark to market when you're not even considering what we in a retail market would consider a VIX, or a volatility on volatility, in other words. And they didn't even take that into account for Basel III. So now they're looking at Basel III and saying, yeah, we probably have to raise the Tier 1 capital again, and we got to divide that by the total exposure and come up with a number that's probably 10 or 15%. Okay, now where are the banks going to get that capital requirement? And that's really what that article is saying. We're maxed out.
Yep.
So mom and pop are maxed out. The banks are maxed out. Where are they going to get that capital? They can't go to the shareholders and say, oh, by the way, let's double or triple up our equity requirements. So does that mean that the banks have to start doing debt for equity swaps in order to drive down that debt level? Don't know. But neither does anybody else. And that's the problem.
By all accounts, reserve cash remain abundant. So stress in the repo market must originate elsewhere. Oddly enough, they didn't think of exploring the root cause, only admitting that it warrants attention. So while repo rates spike could signal reserve scarcity, a cash shortage, this time it's more likely something else. Dealers reaching balance sheet capacity or limits. That's a host of more serious issues. A reserve scarcity is an easy fix because the Fed can just print money and pause quantitative tightening, or if it must, restart quantitative easing. Dealers reaching balance sheet limits, however, is a structural problem that basically demands a crisis before it can be resolved. This is what we want. This is the Austrian economics that we all want. Getting Powell to announce that QT will end after 30 successful months due to funding stresses is one thing. After all, this is the same Powell who is slashing rates into inflation, but rewriting and rethinking entire regulatory frameworks is another much more cumbersome process. This memo from the ISDA, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, this little box right here, very, very telling. All right, listen to me. To facilitate participation by banks in U.S. Treasury markets, including clearing U.S. Treasury security transaction for clients, the agencies should revise the SLR to permanently exclude on-balance sheet U.S. Treasuries from local leverage exposure. So that's imaginary, Mitch. If they could just say I have treasuries, then you know what? I'm going to raise my hand right now, Mitch, and I'm going to say, you know what? I got 5 billion treasuries right now, Mitch. You don't need to see it. You don't need to see my balance sheet. I just have 5 billion treasuries.
It's actually worse than that.
I want to knock this out of the park, man.
Okay. So if you have a treasury, and let's just say you invested in that treasury or bond, call it whatever you want, how are you going to do a mark to market on the value of that bond? And given that graph that you just saw, those little points, those are volatility spikes. Mom and pop can't do that. The dealers themselves can't do that. These guys that wrote this article are at the ground level stating that the balance sheets of the banks aren't even true because they can't mark to market those treasuries. They all assume on a 24-hour basis that everything is peachy keen. But the problem is, no, it's not, because the real value under the hood isn't there. And Travis will post this article below the video so that everybody can go and grab that article itself. it is truly one of the best that Zero Hedge has ever put out. It's fantastic. And it confirms everything that this series of videos that we've been doing has been after. And there's another article, I don't know that we're going to deal with it today because of the length of this, but socialism versus the collective society ties right into this. And I wrote that before, literally a couple of days before we got this Zero Hedge article. But this thing really does tie to the overall problem. So a bank or anybody that tells you, well, our treasuries are worth X, okay, and what are you going to do if it turns out that globally something goes wrong and those treasuries get sliced by 30% in value? Now it's not just 30%. Now you've got to start looking at the underlying assets. Same thing with the mortgage-backed securities. What are you going to do with all these mortgage-backed securities when the housing value drops 40, 50% back to where it was just 5 years ago? So the more the governments delay the inevitable, the worse the outcome is going to be, because the rule of 72 has added on double up from 5 years. That's what you're looking at here. This is why, although they didn't articulate it that same way in this article, they're saying the exact same thing we're saying. It's identical. The debt load has gotten so great, nobody can value this stuff because what happens if they're dancing on a razor blade? If a volatility spike occurs, go ahead, value it. Is it 50 cents, 60 cents, 30 cents on the dollar? Got me. But it most certainly isn't 100 cents on the dollar.
Let me just read the last parts of this article, and then we'll end with some of your conclusions. By doing this, it will mechanically be a permanent, indirect, quantitative easing program and be the next and biggest step towards the end game. Now, I also wanted to say the Fed actually has a triple mandate, not a double mandate, okay? Maximum employment, stable prices, and according to Section 2A of monetary policy objectives, moderate long-term interest rates. It's funny that they left that out in the press conferences. At the end of the day, if dealers have infinite balance sheet space for treasuries, this is QE. It will look like QE, behave like QE, and solve the problems QE is designed to address, but nobody in the official sector will call it that. This is the next step, and the disconnect between repo rates and other reserve scarcity indicators combined with the SEC's Hail Mary to sabotage the current hedge fund buyer make it all the more obvious. Last question for you, Mitch, and go ahead and close us out. Is the U.S. going to become the next China, or is China going to become the next U.S.?
Here's the twist on all of this. The key for any government to survive is stability. So stability is economic stability, and you achieve that by letting the markets do what the markets do and stop the financial engineering. On a global basis, the exact same thing can be said for all the other countries, including those countries that have bought our treasuries and our mortgage-backed securities through the bank dealers themselves. Well, that's going to have to be a joint program to, in other words, China working with the United States, Britain working with the United States, Saudi Arabia working with the United States, everybody that's bought those treasuries, they either have to say, we, our country, in addition to the United States and Canada, are going to have to come up with a better Basel III, and they're going to have to come up with a system to unwind the damages that they've created, or multiple countries will go down. And isn't it interesting that that exact same thing is what we've been saying for the last 45 or 50 days in these videos from the taxing entities? You're going to have to unwind this. You're going to have to come up with a true market value, and you're going to have to sit down and take the pain of what the real values are. And if you don't, this will blow to shreds. This is the math. It is the rule of 72. So at the local level, we got a problem. And on the federal level, globally, we have a problem. The key is the unwinding. The key is stop this nonsense of using the bonds to buy missiles, and everybody work together to fix the mess, or governments will fall.
And I'll say also, Mitch, stop suppressing freedom of speech and stop suppressing citizens of whatever country they're in. Would you agree with that as well?
100%, but that's the market, right? Let the market do what the market is going to do. The market is mom and pop. Mom and pop is the economic engine. Real simple.
Yeah, well said, sir. Well said. I'm going to get him out of here, Mitch. You know, hopefully you guys made it with us to the end here. Again, go into that document. I had to read it 2 or 3 times myself. It is a great workup, a lot more details that I missed. And don't forget, you guys, everything we talk about is in the link of the description of this video. Step number 1, sign, and more importantly, educate yourself on the petition. And then step 2, take the course I made for free. Become a teacher, train your community how to fight back against fraudulent overvaluation. And other than that, Mitch, I thank you for your time. Happy Sunday to the viewers. And if you guys are out there just living your life, you guys already know we wish you luck and we hope you win.